Faith Church has a mission statement. If you're listening to this and you are part of Faith Church, do you know our mission statement? I wonder. We came up with it a few years ago, and we were trying to base it on Jesus' teaching in Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 through 40. There he says that the greatest command in the Mosaic Law is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so because we wanted our church to be on mission based on Jesus' teaching, we condensed that to love God, love people. Now that's nothing ingenious. A lot of churches have that as their mission statement. But does a mission statement guarantee that any church is going to actually operate according to the mission? Well, of course not. It does seem wise, though, to have the mission statement as a guiding principle. It also seems wise to do regular evaluation so that we're discerning. Are we operating according to that missional vision? Or have we wandered from Jesus' teaching about mission? It seems like a good thing. But what we're going to see in today's teaching is that Root and Bertrand are not so sure. They are the authors of this book, When Church Stops Working, A Future for Your Congregation Beyond More Money, Programs, and Innovation. And here's the title of chapter 6. Forget the mission statement. Get a watchword. A watchword? What's a watchword? Why do we need to get one? Well, their title points out that they believe that we should be about watchwords and not necessarily mission statements. They talk about the rise of mission statements. It's out there in business and in the marketplace and churches. Everyone seems to have a mission statement. And we're told implicitly that you have to have a mission statement or things will not go well for you. But here's what they point out. A mission statement and good missional theology are not the same thing. What do they mean? They're saying something very important here. It kind of seems self-evident if you look at the idea. A mission statement and good missional theology. Well, obviously, they're two different concepts, but here's the important difference. A mission statement, they write, is an agreement about how a group of people will direct their actions. It puts human actions at the center. That is true for Faith Church's mission statement, right? Love God, love people. Now, clearly, our mission statement is a condensation of Jesus' teaching, and that means our mission statement is biblical. It's not wrong. But we have to admit that it is about what we humans will do. We are saying that we will love God and love people, and we should. Loving God and loving people is wonderful. We can't underestimate the importance of living with love for disciples of Jesus. God is love. So you might be wondering, then, what's wrong with our mission statement? Well, it's not wrong. But we have to admit, it's true. Root and Bertrand's description of mission statements as human-centered, it applies to ours too. They go on then to describe how missional theology is so different from human-centered mission statements. Here's what they write. Missional theology puts emphasis on God's own action. God is the agent in missional theology. Now, when they're using that word agent, don't think of something like an FBI agent. They're referring to this general definition of agent and agency. An agent is just one who acts, who does things. In other words, God is the agent in missional theology because God is doing the action. He does the work. He is on the move. He's alive and well. That should get us thinking about the theme that we have been hearing from Root and Bertrand throughout the entire book so far, that of waiting. We need to be a church that waits and listens and watches for how God's Spirit is at work in us, in our community, all around us. But, they write, mission statements don't lead us to waiting. Now, they clarify, we shouldn't think of mission statements as sinful. But what they write is this: we think the problem for the church is when the mission statement is not paired with a watchword. And when I thought about that, have you ever heard of a watchword? I really hadn't before I read this chapter. They had my attention. What is this that they're talking about? Because they clearly think watchwords are important. In fact, they say this: the watchword is the foundation that the waiting church builds on. If they're right, that's important. We need to learn what a watchword is. But are they right? Well, let's see. They say this: a watchword is a phrase or even a slogan that encompasses a much larger story. It's shorthand for a story of a deep experience that has shaped a group of people. The person with the watchword is called to watch with that word, to look at the world and interact with the world in and through this shorthand story. When I read that, I thought, kind of sounds like a password or like spies that have a code word. But that's not what they're talking about. They actually planned on talking about this because they realized some people would think that. What they say is this: a password or a code word, it keeps people out. But a watchword isn't there to keep things away or out. It's there to direct our attention. It's also there to form us. They describe a watchword as kind of this shorthand story that gets deep inside us. It transforms us. It helps us to see the world in a new way. In particular, it's helping us to see God's work in the world. They write that a watchword is a story or slogan of how this church, this community, has encountered the living God. That's intriguing to me. Encountering the living God, that sounds like what we want, what we desire. We believe that through the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, that God has made it possible for all of us to encounter Him. We believe that God loves us so much that He made a way to reconcile us to Him. So is it possible that a watchword could help us experience God and live in that reality of experiencing God? I mean, I love what I'm hearing, but I have to admit, I'm a little skeptical. Is this just a gimmick that's going to end up being just another mission statement? Well, Root and Bertrand suggest that in a waiting church, we find our watchword and then help our people live it out. Our waiting isn't a dull action, but an attentiveness. And the watchword is what shapes that attention. In other words, the watchword helps us to wait. It guides us into looking attentively for how God is at work. I wondered how does a word or a little story do this? Well, they illustrate a famous watchword, that of one that God gave to Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights era. Things were stagnating in the Civil Rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. felt. And he was doing some prayer, and he heard God say to him this phrase: "When there is no way, I'll make a way." And so Root and Bertrand explain the mission of the civil rights movement was possible only because they were formed by the watchword. They waited. They're waiting in action because they knew that out of no way, God makes a way. That watchword had impact. It formed them. They could see God at work through it and pursue Him, follow Him, be enlivened by His work in the world. And so they suggest that church leadership teams are correct when they oversee a congregation's mission. But more importantly, they need to help a congregation find their watchword. Then they need to lead. mainly by repeating, rehearsing, and retelling the watchword. And so I wondered, can we do that? Can we ask God for a watchword for Faith Church? Now, Root and Bertrand say that they themselves can't give us one. This is something that is unique to each particular church in its unique era, time, and place, and people. And so, because we are utterly different from one another, we need a watchword given to us by God. They ask us to consider then, on the search for this, as we listen to this, how are we already encountering God in the world? Well, to do that, they encourage two things. First of all, we need to learn to encounter each other, and then secondly, we need to wait in the right way so that we encounter God. They ask some questions that I think we would do very well to attempt to answer. Where do I see God in my life, in the life of the people around me? How is God a character in our story? Where do we see God working in the midst, our midst, for the salvation of the world? These are great questions. And so therefore, our leadership team should be listening for stories that people are telling that help answer those questions. We should be inviting people to share their stories of God at work. This reminds me of our evangelical heritage that has a history of sharing testimonies of how God has been at work in our lives. And so then Root and Bertrand write, churches find their watchword when they not only hear the stories and invite the stories, but try to discern that theme of God's work through the stories. And when we search for a theme in the stories, we're searching for the watchword, we're not using some marketing slogan. That's not what this is. Years ago, I read a compelling book called Selling Out the Church, The Dangers of Church Marketing by Kennison and Street. Really, really convicting about how easy it is for us to believe that the world of marketing is what we need as our salvation. A friend of mine often says the church needs better marketing. Now, it's a joke. And what she is pointing to is the reality that hypocritical, angry, selfish Christians can really make the news. There's this Instagram account called Preachers and Sneakers. Maybe you've seen it. And it makes this very point, I think, in a compelling way. The account shows pictures of preachers that they got from other Instagram photos or from websites. And then it puts pictures of that preacher's sneakers, clothing that they are wearing in the photos from the manufacturer's websites along with the price tag. And sometimes they're wearing shoes that are $500 or an outfit that's $2,000, showing our hypocrisy to wanting to purchase luxury. We are marketing ourselves, and often what we're marketing is our hypocrisy. We're also tempted to buy into the marketing tactics that are out there in the world. Remember the He Gets Us commercials from this past year in the Super Bowl, trying to present Jesus to the world in a more compelling way? But does the church need better marketing? In a way, I get where my friend is coming from, but no, we should not enslave ourselves to marketing. Instead, we need to wait, listen, and watch for the living God who is at work in the world. And perhaps a watchword can help us and guide us. Root and Bertrand continue in their chapter by expanding on those two movements they mentioned earlier. Number one, we need to learn to encounter others, and number two, we need to learn to encounter God if we want to better see Him at work in us and through us. Now, there was part of me that thought about this. Encountering others, encountering God. Is this just another way to say what Jesus said about the two greatest commands? Love God, love people? Well, we'll see. I think the authors might be onto something more here, though. Now, first, again, they ask us to think about encountering others. And who are these people? If you could look back through your own history, The people in your life that you really encountered, and they encountered you. The people who really saw you deeply. Maybe it was a teacher, a coach, a parent, a spouse, a best friend. Who in your life can you say you really encountered and they encountered you? Root and Bertrand describe an experiment that they were involved in as the acronym PEAL. And it was this idea of photography and poetry and creating unique images of another person who you don't know. And so you have to reveal yourself to that person. And it really helped their church family encounter one another. Their point is this, that when we really truly encounter the depths of another person, we learn to delight in one another, which in turn leads us to serve one another. And so it got me thinking, what can our church do? And maybe if you're not from Faith Church and you're listening to this, what can other churches do to create experiences like that experiment, to help us encounter one another deeply? Secondly, we encounter God. Root and Bertrand refer to Karl Barth, a famous theologian. And he pointed out, we can encounter God anywhere because God is so creatively self-revealing in nature, in other people, in all things. But Barth said this, while God can use anything, God does use certain things. What certain things? Is Barth saying that there are actually certain or special places where God reveals himself more clearly, more powerfully? Well, pretty much yes, he's saying that. And he's referring to places of preaching, prayer, and mission where we can encounter God. Now, in a way, I thought that's Christianity 101. But it's also so needed. We can encounter God through the Bible. This is not something to be taken for granted. That's why the Bible is so important to our worship gatherings and our classes. Now let me be clear. When we gather as Christians, God is central. The Bible is not. We worship God, not the Bible. We really need to put the Bible in its rightful place as a Spirit-inspired text to point us to the living God who we can encounter. And so we are right to immerse ourselves in God's Word, asking Him to speak to us. I think of what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 2:12. We have not received the Spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we may understand what God has freely given us. So whenever you read the Bible, whether you're at a worship service listening to a sermon, or in a class, or listening to a podcast, or just reading your Bible on your own, you can pray that prayer of 1 Corinthians 2:12 to help you encounter God. Spirit of God, help me understand. That's a prayer of inviting God to speak. That's a prayer of inviting encounter with God. They also point out that sacraments are another way that we encounter God when we gather together in worship. Now, in our evangelical theology, we hold to two sacraments given to us by Jesus, baptism and communion. Both are wonderful rituals in which we can encounter God, and we should. Now, we need to guard our hearts and our minds because ritual can very easily become empty, just routine. We observe communion monthly, and we don't ever want it to become routine. And so we view it in three ways. Remembrance of Jesus' gift, of His body and His blood. Proclamation of the good news that His gift gives us. And finally, participation with Him at His table. We commune with Him. We experience Him. We encounter Him by faith. And we listen to what He might say to us. Finally, Root and Bertrand emphasize that we encounter God as we follow Him in action in the community. That means we're looking outwardly. We're not just looking for God in our worship services or in the Bible. We're looking outwardly. He's at work all around us. God is alive and well, and we encounter Him when we follow Him in that work. And so we serve in places in the community. It's kind of like MLK's watchword, where there is no way, I'll make a way. We follow God as he makes his way into the world. And we look for those stories, and we share those stories of encounter, our living God. So what stories do you have? How have you seen God at work? I urge you to share them. I urge you to talk about them. Discern that theme that God's work is in us and through us and in the community. And when we discern that theme, we might be able to say, this is the watchword that God has given us that can enliven and invigorate us to continue to see him at work. Let's pursue our living and active God. Let's listen for him, because he's alive and well.